Any session where you look down at aces early on should be a really nice session, right? Hopefully? Maybe? Yeah. Let's review this one together. Yes, starting with aces and see how it goes. Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. Welcome to episode 8 of my vlog. This one we are back in Orange City, Florida, playing some more 1-2, and this one gets a little bit strange. A whole bunch of very weird spots, and without further ado, let's jump right into it. Alright, this first hand we are under the gun +1. Look down at aces. No complaints about hand selection on this one. Open limp under the gun, attack to 15. This is about 15-20 minutes into the session, give or take, and 15 seem to be doing just fine. End up getting called by the big blind, and a very, very quick limp re-raise by the player under the gun for 68 total. So a couple things to note right this moment. First and foremost is I did not reload preflop. That is 100% my bad. I should have been more aware of my stack size, and just in general, this is why you can keep some reload chips in your pocket to quickly do this, and I just must have brain farted and not done it. So 100% my fault on that one. The other thing to note in this situation is that I don't really have much information on the under the gun player other than the fact that they did a limp re-raise. They have a shorter stack, and obviously I'm not going anywhere with aces here against them, so whatever that is. But the big blind is someone who I have played with before, and they are definitely on the looser and fishy side of the spectrum, and in this session especially, just again in the first 20 minutes or so of the session, they have definitely been looking like they want to gamble quite a bit. So in a situation like this, while sometimes you may consider going for a 4-bet, this is a spot where if he was the kind of guy who would just get anything in preflop, sure, but this is probably the person who's more likely to make calling mistakes than they are going to make shoving mistakes or giving a 4-bet action mistakes, and as such, I think it's just going to be far better to call in this situation instead of going for a 4-bet, even a very, very small 4-bet. So I decide to stick to that plan and take a moment and then call. Big blind doesn't take too much time before calling as well, and onward we're going to go with a little side pop between myself and the big blind. Flop comes out King 10 3 rainbow, and obviously given the SPR there's no way we're folding here, not looking for that in the slightest. They check to me. I fire for 30 after a couple of moments. They very quickly call, and at first glance this probably looks absolutely ridiculous, but I think it's worth talking about for a quick moment. So this is obviously not the kind of thing you would want to do against a very competent opponent in my opinion, but against a very bad opponent, especially one who is very, very likely to either make check raise mistakes, which they have done in the past, or possibly make check call mistakes with a very, very wide range of hands. Essentially the $30 is going to get action most all of the time against a player like this. So because of that, I don't want to let this streak get checked through. I also think they're going to make mistakes on turns. I think they're going to make mistakes right this moment. And again, like, you could take the check this behind and give them the chance to fire turns. Totally, totally fine. I just thought this person was more likely to make mistakes against a very, very small bet here on the flop, and that's why I decided to go for 30. Yes, 15% pot is very, very small, but again, I think it's going to work best here. So with all of that said, the turn is the Queen of Diamonds. Not my absolute favorite card in the entire deck, but by the same token, against this particular player, still going to be following through with the plan regardless of what happens here. So they ask for a count. He announces that he's all in. Get it all in right there along with him, and against a lot of players, this is going to be a card that I absolutely hate. Fills up a ton of stuff, including 2 pairs that now beat me, but against this particular player, with just how terribly they're playing this session and have played in the past, there's just zero chance that I'm getting away from this. So flip it up. River is the Jack. They show Ace Deuce of Hearts. Not really sure what you're doing there, guy, but pretty much this was the entire plan. Give him as much rope as possible to make terrible decisions. He did exactly that, and unfortunately we end up getting there together and chop. And the other player, weirdly enough, had kings, flop stop set, and sucks to be him, but you know, this whole hand was really about how to maximize against the big blind. Gave him maximal opportunity to put in the most amount of money with the worst possible hand. Did exactly that, and unfortunately doesn't go my direction. At least I get half the pot, but I'd much rather walk away with the full thing. Oh well, on to the next hand we go. This next spot, we are in the cutoff, about 15 minutes later, give or take. It's a $5 button straddle, down at red 4s. Big blind comes along. $5 call by our friend in early position. Guy who took the other player's spot comes in. I limp behind, totally fine. And just for the record, the guy over on the button, yes, he did straddle, but he has all of his chips perfectly lined up, all of the pips lined up, and that is just not the kind of player who's ever going to attack their straddle. So I'm not really concerned about that, and something that I definitely keep in mind when getting involved in straddle pots. So flop comes out 5-5 deuce, rainbow. Everyone checks to me, decide to lead for 15. Totally fine. I think this is going to pick it up some percentage of the time. And obviously, if I get involved with the fishy player, I'm totally okay with that as well. Everyone else folds. We end up going heads up to the turn. Turn is a jack of hearts. They check to me. Decide to check behind. 8 of spades on the river. They check and think for a moment. And they fire it out for 35, and I very quickly call. And this is one of those where I really should be calling with fourth pair very often, but against this particular opponent, the way they've been playing, pretty much all of the gut shots are going to do this for them. A lot of like weird hands. Sure, he can have a 5. Weirdly enough, he will have a jack or an 8 some percent of the time here, but there's just so many like dumb, silly hands that I think they're going to show up with. Even things like deuce X, I think they could have in this situation, and we beat that. So while having 4s isn't my absolute favorite hand in the entire world to have here, since I do block things like ace 4 and 4-6 and stuff like that, this is still one where I'm expecting to win this totally enough of the time against this particular opponent. Again, you really have to keep that in mind when you're playing against these kind of really, really aggressive, more maniac players. Sometimes you're just going to have to loosen it up a little bit, take some slightly atypical lines, and in this situation, did exactly that. I believe they ended up showing ace 3 of hearts, so didn't get there this time, ended up winning the entire pot, so no complaints whatsoever. Now let's move on to the next one. A little while later, we are in the hijack. Limp under the gun by our friend. So we are definitely going to be isolating here with queen 10 suited. Just go up to 15. I think it's going to get heads up against that player a good chunk of the time, and this is definitely the kind of spot that I want, being in position with a decently playable hand and likely heads up against our fishy friend. So definitely happy with all this. Oddly enough, though, big blind continues and the fishy player folds. I don't know what the hell's going on here sometimes, honestly. Not going to complain about the flop, though. Flop comes 10-9-5 with 1 spade, so pick up top pair with a backdoor draw, and they fire out for 7, which is very atypical for them. So this is the kind of spot where I like to attack this. I think a bunch of second-best hands can and will continue. Things like draws like to try to price themselves in with this kind of small $7 bet, and I like to attack that as much as possible. And if they have a big hand, you know, they can definitely have them, but I think there's a bunch of kind of weaker, more marginal stuff that is going to take this kind of line, and I do pretty darn well against a lot of the marginal stuff. So they call the flop raise. Turn is the 9 of clubs. They check over to us, and I fire this out for 40. So the 9 here on the turn is actually a pretty darn good card for us, since it massively diminishes the amount of nuttish hands they could have. Things like 10-9 are now much tougher to make, pocket 9s is much tougher to make now, and there's really just not going to be a tremendous amount of super nut combos, and I do put at least some of those in there for a player who is deciding to lead and then lead call. However, if we think about the kind of hands that I'm really trying to go after here, I'm trying to go after things like worst 10, and there are a couple of them, and I'm also looking to capitalize against the draws, so things like queen jack and stuff like that. And I think I'm going to be able to get this away for 40. I think those kind of hands will continue for 40 enough of the time, and I also occasionally am going to value time myself when they have something like ace 10 or king 10. However, I don't think that those hands are always going to take that really small donk approach. I think a lot more of them, I'm not saying they should, but tend to lead this for something like 10, 15, or 20 on the flop instead of the smaller 7 when they have a hand that they deem as a little bit stronger. Again, I'm really putting a lot more marginal stuff in their hand based upon that $7 bet on the flop itself. So that's really factoring in here, and I think 40 is going to get the job here, going to get us some extra value, and pretty much plan on bet turn, check river behind, and expect to win this a decent chunk of the time. So with all of that said, so big blind takes a while and finally makes the call. River is the 3 of spades. And I'm going to continue with my plan and check the river behind. So show queen 10. They also show queen 10, and we end up shipping, well, half of the pot. So chopping seems to be the name of the game for this session, but again, I'm totally fine with the line overall. If you have any thoughts, if you would size anything differently, or if you would just call the flop, please leave a comment down below. I would love to hear what you would do in this hand and exactly why you would take that line. But until then, let's get on to the next one. A little while later, we are in the cutoff. Look down at queen 10 off. Limp under the gun, limp under the gun +1. Folds to me, I attack to 15, and this is kind of the bottom side of my isolation range. If it was just the fishy opponent, I'm totally good with it. Against 2 players, it's a little bit more tough, especially given the stack size of the under the gun player. But again, it's kind of the bottom side. What are you going to do? I'm still totally fine with it overall, though. I don't really want to fold this, and I definitely don't want to limp it behind. So flop comes out queen 8-8 rainbow. Check by the under the gun limper. Bet for 30 by our fishy friend, and obviously not going to be folding here. Don't really see much reason to raise either. Just give the most amount of room for mistake potential from the fishy player. Under the gun limper comes along as well. Turn is a very, very pretty queen. No complaints about turning a boat, huh? Shove by under the gun for not too much, just 56 total. Very quick fold by our fishy friend. Double check that I have it. A little shocked that I do. And of course end up showing my hand, and I'm just assuming we're chopping this pot, but shockingly he shows up with an 8. So really, really nice turn for us. But again, this is another spot where I thought we were going to be chopping, just based on the way that they've been playing, but I'm not going to complain in the slightest about shipping this one. It is a little bit weird that they're open limping off of that stack size with ace-8 suited, but again, this is 1-2, these kind of things happen. Let's get on to the next one. All right, not too much later, we find ourselves on the button. Limp under the gun. Look down at ace-queen off. No complaints about that. Limp behind by the cutoff. Decide to attack to 15. Totally standard on the action and the size itself. Small blind calls. This is someone who does know who I am, which is always something that I like to note. Under the gun player calls, and the cutoff decides to limp re-raise to 33 total. So at this point, my options are between calling and coming over the top, and I decide to come over the top. I don't really love the stock size of the player in the small blind, and I don't really want to call here and create kind of a weird, odd, bloated side pot kind of situation. So I'm totally fine just going for it myself. I think the small blind is really going to have nothing they can continue with very often here, so I suspect they are going to go away a decent chunk. They had 3-bet me once, maybe twice by this point in the session, so I really didn't think there was too much in their calling range that they were going to love facing a 115 4-bet 4. So they get out of the way. Under the gun folds as well. End up accomplishing my goal of getting heads up against the cutoff. And they show Jack-8 off. Not sure what's going on, but happy on the flop to 7-7-5. Good on the turn. Hate the river, which is a Jack of spades. So end up making the payoff over to them. Really not much else you can do in this situation. Again, you can make an argument for flatting it pre-flop in certain situations. I didn't think this was going to be the exact spot to do so. I think cleaning up the equity and getting it heads up to yourself is totally fine with the bloated dead layover from the small blind and the under the gun call. Alright, on the next one. A while later, we find ourselves in the small blind. Look down at ace-queen off again. This time there's a $5 button straddle. Decided to go to 20. These spots always kind of suck a little bit, honestly, when you're in the small against a button straddle and you have a hand that is playable. just kind of always a little bit awkward, but just going to have to work through it, and that's what we're going to do in this spot. So I end up getting called by 2 players in middle position and face a shove from the player on the button for 104 total. This player had been a little bit loose, a little bit splashy, and just keep in mind this is effectively a 2-5 hand, and we're functionally playing for what, 20 big blinds? Like, I'm not folding here in the slightest. So I decide to come over the top. I don't really want to give great prices to the players behind. One of them shorter stack, doesn't really matter either way, but against the hijack opponent, I don't really see much reason to give them a great price. So middle position ended up calling. The hijack ended up going away, and we're going to be getting ace queen all in preflop again, which is not something that I like to do a bunch of times per session, but seems to be happening in this one. And I'm not the kind of person who tends to hold off on showing my cards in these kind of situations. I just show it and get down to business. I don't really like to get into those situations of like, oh, you have to show first, or you have to just show your damn hand. Show your damn hand, quickens up the game, trust me, makes things so much easier. And people hate feeling like they got slow rolled, even if they actually didn't get slow rolled. It's just so much easier just to show your hand, I promise. Yes, you give up a little bit of information, but it's going to be fine at the end of the day. So no one has shown their hand yet, so when the board rolls off ace, king, 6, I'm pretty happy with the flop. 4 on the turn, 6 on the river. Button ends up showing his pocket 8s. No go for them. And the middle position player shows ace 7 of clubs. Again, I don't know what the heck's going on here. All I can tell you is that because the $5 straddle is on, this is functionally a 2-5 game, so obviously not getting away from this for roughly 20 big blinds against the button, and against the other player, whatever. They're shorter stacked, they do silly things, and sometimes they get there, and yet another chop pot for this session. Alright, well, let's wrap it up, and hopefully the last hand of the session won't be another chop pot. This last hand, we're on the button. Look down at ace 10 suited. It's raised to 7 by middle position, call by the hijack, call by the cutoff, and I very, very much prefer 3-betting this instead of just flatting. I know a lot of 1-2 players like to just default flat this, but I promise you, 3-betting and squeezing here does so much better. You know, without like other information, trust me, this does very, very well. So I end up getting called by the original player who doesn't seem incredibly confident, and the cutoff comes along as well. Same guy with the pocket 8s from the previous hand for what it's worth. Flop comes 10, 7, 7 with 2 clubs, no spade. And fire this out for 35 into 115. And while the size itself is definitely on the kind of small looking side of the spectrum, this is actually kind of fine sizing when it comes to 3-bet pots. Typically you have a smaller size c-bet in the first place, and I think this is totally fine. I don't see too much reason to go like 50 or above. Don't really see much reason to go smaller. I think 35 is going to do just fine with all the hands, maybe not 100% of the hands, but a lot of the hands that I decide to c-bet with in this exact situation. So I end up going again 35 and 115. Quick fold by both of the other players. No chop pot on this one. Ship the little small medium one over here. No complaints whatsoever. So kind of a weird little session overall, but honestly, playing 1-2, this isn't the most atypical thing in the slightest, so keep that in mind when you're like, what the heck are some of these hands? Yeah, it's 1-2. It happens sometimes. So overall results for the session, not complaining the slightest. A little 4-hour session, plus 243 total, 61 on the hourly, and plus 122 BB per 100. And there was a small little hand on the way out, wasn't all that interesting, but a nice little win with pocket kings, and ended up wrapping up a shorter session. I'm trying to play some longer sessions. I believe there are some longer ones coming up in future vlog episodes, so keep an eye out for that. But if you like this one, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. I'd really, really appreciate it, and let me know what you want to see more of. If you like these kind of pots, if you want to see other kind of pots, let me know. I'd love to hear what you say in the comments. I do read pretty much every single comment. I probably shouldn't, but I definitely end up doing that a very large chunk of the time. So drop one down below, and again, a thumbs up and sub if you're liking this kind of stuff would be massively appreciated as well. And that's going to wrap it up for this one. I really hope you enjoyed, and just for the record, if you want to talk more poker, not just in YouTube comments, but with a community of players players that love the game just as much as you do, make sure to join us over on the Red Chip Poker Discord, redchippoker.com/discord to join for free, jump in the conversation, post hands, and I'm over there all the time as well, so there's that as well. But I'll see you guys back shortly with another vlog installment, but until then, good luck out there, and happy grinding.